Alright, so I have assembled before me, or should I say disassembled before me, the pieces of a hot end. This is not the exact hot end off the Ender 3. This is a Yusong J-Head V6 hot end. It is 1.75 millimeter in filament diameter, and it has a 0.4 millimeter nozzle. So those two things are just like the Ender 3. You will notice the biggest difference between this and the one on your Ender 3 is the fact that this guy here, which is referred to as the heat sink, well, excuse me, I should be more direct. This piece is the heat sink. And I'll explain why that's not the heat sink in a second. But the heat sink on your Ender 3 is going to be square and red. So that's really the only difference. The components are all there, and the pieces are all the same. So let's go over the pieces and make sure that we have them all here. The first one we're going to need for a hot end, obviously, is a nozzle. You can't dial in your parameters without a nozzle. The next thing we're going to need is our PTFE tube to feed filament into it. Obviously we need that or nothing will come out. This is what's referred to as a PTFE coupler. We have our radiator or heat sink, and this actually is attached to a piece. This tube normally comes out on the Ender 3. It comes out quite easily with the release of a little tiny Allen wrench key. This one doesn't want to come out. I don't have a pair of vice grips on me right now, so we're going to leave it there. But that little piece, that tube connecting this piece and the actual heat block, that's called your throat or your heat break. So now that we know that we have all the pieces here, and here's the block, now that we know that we have all the pieces here, we're going to go ahead and assemble it real quick. So I'm going to take this guy, this is the top end where the PTFE coupler goes. So go ahead and thread that in there. Now the PTFE tubing, the other end of this would be attached to your extruder. If I were to go ahead and depress this and push this in here, I could get it in there. I don't really want to get my PTFE tube stuck in there right now. You can take it out by depressing the lever and pulling it out, but that tube is a little bent and I don't want to get it jammed in here. So just so you know, that's how you do that. There's a little seal here, and if you push in both sides, it's a release that allows you to slide the tube in and out. The other thing we need to assess here is we're going to be putting this piece on next, and this is the actual heat block. You'll notice that there are 4 wires going to the heat block that wire 2 components. The top component in this picture is the thermistor. You'll hear talk about thermistors a lot. There's one in the heat block and there's one in the heated bed as well. This little red dot in there, basically what it is it's a thermometer. It's an electric thermometer that sends a temperature signal back to the main board to let you know what temperature your hot end is at. This other apparatus down here is the actual heating element. Now this runs through the length of the heating block, and basically they run power into there until it heats to the temperature we want, and when that is sensed by the thermistor, it stops sending power, or it regulates the current to stand it at a steady voltage to keep it at a relatively similar power level, or temperature level. So in order to do this, next part we're going to go ahead and thread our throat or our heat break, which is already attached to our heat sink, into the top of our heating element, our heat block there. Okay, you want to make sure that you don't have any gaps in the seal of the rotation there. And this one I can actually tighten all the way down, and that's okay, and that works just fine on this model. On the Ender 3, you're going to have a little gap in there, and that gap is there pretty much indicated by those 2 screws that go up through it. So some people say to remove those screws, but that's really a good gauge of where your throat should be to avoid heat creep, and you really want to leave those screws in there. So this one doesn't have them, as you can see. Now I'm going to put the nozzle in there. And generally you only want about a millimeter between here and here, especially on the Ender 3. You do want a little gap there, but you want it to be minimal. This head won't turn in anymore. because I have this seated all the way up against it. Now if I screw it out, and then I can screw the head up some more. So again, you want to make sure that inside this heating element, the butt of the nozzle is seated up against the throat or the heat break, this bar extending from the heat sink. And the reason for that is because if there's even the slightest gap in here, it will start to ooze up out the side, and that's when you see all this gushing stuff come pouring out and covering your hot end. Okay, and then you have to clean it, but you have to heat it to clean it, and then it's kind of hard to clean. It's a pain. It's not hard. It's just really a pain, and you feel silly for not having your nozzle screwed all the way in. That's one of the other reasons why it's important, if your stuff is dirty, to change the nozzle while it's hot, because sometimes you can't quite press it or turn it in there. You might think that it's seated up against the heat break, and it's actually seated up against a piece of solid plastic that's already accumulated there. Because if you notice any looseness in there, you're going to want to tighten that up. Otherwise, you're going to have leakage all over your hot end, right down your heat block, and probably a failed print. So now that we've got that assembled, you know that the fan normally goes on the outside. This fan isn't that great. It's just the one that came with it, but it works for right now. I will create a housing for this fan when I put it on the printer that I'm building right now, but at the moment, this is just going to go back in my parts pile. So now that you've seen how to fully assemble and disassemble a hot end, I hope you're a little more familiar with the components. Remember, when somebody says thermistor, it's this little thing right here. I could take it out. It looks like it has like little mercury in there, like the inside of a thermometer. It's clear, and then there's red inside. And then the heating element here. So be careful with these wires. You don't want to break anything out of here. It's not easy to reattach. You'll have to get a whole new heating element, and that's no fun either. So, and now just to wrap up this video before we get into the actual hot end fix, this should look a lot more familiar to you. Seeing as how this is an Ender 3 guide, we might as well take a look at the Ender 3 hot end. The reason I showed you the other one was because if you're going to be using 3D printers, it's best to familiarize yourself with all the components and parts so you know intimately what you're dealing with. So, in this instance, this is our heat sink. As I said, it's red, it's kind of blocky and square, and it's got several bolt holes through it that the other one didn't have. Now these ones are to mount it to the X carriage. These ones right here are to mount the heat block to it. In between there is this little tube, and that's the tube that I showed you on the other one that wouldn't come out. This one does come out quite easily. It's called the throat or the heat break, and it's held in place by this little guy here. That is your smallest Allen key. The nozzle is located right here, and this is the heat block. As I showed you before, this one also has 4 wires, 2 for the thermistor, 2 for the heating element, and that's pretty much the breakdown of a hot end. Thanks for watching this guide, guys. Stay tuned, because in the next video we are going to be upgrading our hot end on the Ender 3 with, like I said, Luke's hot end fix, which should solve a lot of problems and keep you from jamming up down the road.